Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Fulbrighter podcast. Fulbrighter is an exclusive networking platform for Fulbright alumni and grantees. The platform lets you keep up to date with news from the global community of Fulbrighters and connect with fellow alumni and grantees from around the world. If you're a current grantee or an alumni from an official Fulbright program, head to fulbrighternetwork.com to create your account. My name is Gabriela Jimenez, and I'm a journalist and the community manager for the Fulbrighter platform. Today, I will have a conversation with Lev Horodyskyj, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing that. Lev is an astrobiologist and educational innovator from Arizona, currently leading the nonprofit Science Voices, which aims at helping overlooked communities improve their science education using modern and low-cost approaches. He earned a PhD in geosciences and astrobiology from Pennsylvania State University and has spent 10 years working on digital science curricula at Arizona State University. Lev has been granted Fulbright Awards twice, first in Indonesia in 2020 and then in Brazil in 2022. He's currently in the country researching stingless tropical bees and fostering a cross-nation knowledge exchange between both Brazil and Indonesia. Hi, Lev. Welcome to the Fulbrighter podcast. There's so much to talk about.
Hi, nice to meet you. Thank you for having me.
It's nice to meet you too. So first of all, I'm not sure all of our listeners will have a clear understanding of what astrobiology is. I know I probably don't. So would you like to explain a little bit more about what this field of study is comprised of?
Absolutely. Astrobiology is an interdisciplinary field that combines together geology, biology, and astronomy in the search for life elsewhere in the universe. In order to do that, we also need to understand life's origins, how it's evolved on planet Earth, and what its potential future can be. What's fun about astrobiology is because it's interdisciplinary, you have a lot of skills that translate across fields. So there's a lot of aspects of scientific research that falls under astrobiology. You can go at an astrobiology conference, you can go anywhere from one session can be on planetary formation, another one could be on octopi intelligence, and another one can be on sustainability issues. So it's a very fun field that lets you explore lots of different topics.
Sounds very multi-knowledge based, right? So how did you end up specializing in this field? Was it something that you always knew as a child that you had been driven more towards like the science experiments, or how did you end up deciding to go for that route?
I liked space and I liked dinosaurs, and astrobiology let me do both.
Interesting. So that sounds like a fun career choice.
Absolutely.
I'm also interested in how you first decided to apply for Fulbright, right? So when did you first hear about the program, or how did it come into your life?
So I'd been at Arizona State University for 5 or 6 years at that point, and I'd been looking for new challenges. We had been working on developing an astrobiology online lab science course that was really interesting. It was a lot of fun. We used intelligent tutoring technologies to help guide students through all these various topics. We also use simulators. I designed a lot of those simulators and integrated them into the activities. But at some point, it became a process of developing the same materials over and over again in different formats, which is exciting because it allows us to take the methodology we developed and apply it to other topics. But after many years of doing that, it starts to become a little boring. You start wanting to look for new challenges. And one of the challenges that I was interested in was the challenge of connectivity. When you're working at an R1 institute in a metropolitan area, you don't really think about connectivity that much because it's a given. You have high-speed internet, modern computers. But if you think about the state of Arizona, Arizona has a range of connectivities from high connectivity in the metropolitan areas to almost no connectivity in some of the reservation areas. And so it started to bother me a bit that we were developing materials that assumed high-speed internet access or easy access to high-speed internet access, which isn't always the case. And so what appealed to me about the Fulbright program is it gave me the potential to go somewhere and challenge myself with the tool set that I had to see if I could do something different, if that tool set is still usable in places where connectivity is really low. And if that tool set isn't usable, what do I do and what can I develop to do a lot of the work that I had been doing in digital education in areas with really poor connectivity?
So, did you always want to go to Indonesia? Because I understand that's where you went on your first Fulbright, or was that a consequence of maybe meeting the researcher, or how did you make that choice?
So for Indonesia, I'd always had an interest in going to Ukraine because my family's originally from Ukraine. And so I'd always been interested in developing programs in Ukraine. But for Indonesia, I did a trip one Thanksgiving. I had won a competition. I was a finalist in a competition for journalism on writing about cities and sustainability. And so the final determination was being made in Jakarta, I think at the end of November of one of those years, I think 2017. And so I took the opportunity and went there, and I really, really liked Indonesia. It was this big surprise. I didn't know anything about Indonesia when I arrived. I hadn't had time to do any research on it before I arrived. But after I arrived, I had this wonderful experience in Banyuwangi with a tour guide that took me into volcanoes and coffee shops and sulfur processing locations and some festivals in local towns. And I found that I really enjoyed my time there. So when I was thinking of what's the most challenging thing I could do, I was thinking Indonesia because it's a place that I'm not familiar with, where I don't know the language, where there are probably a lot of remote islands to work with. And if I could get my ideas working here, then it should be easier to implement it in a lot of other places I'm interested in.
That sounds like a great choice. Indonesia is indeed a very wonderful country with a wonderful culture. As I understand, COVID cut that experience short for you. So, after I understand you couldn't really finish your research there, but did you always know you were gonna try again with the Fulbright program? So were you already thinking about, okay, I need another award somewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. After I had finished up at Arizona State University, where I had been working, I wanted to do. I had gotten the Fulbright Award for Indonesia for the 2019-2020 school year, with the program starting in 2020. And one of my friends suggested, hey, you don't have any attachments to Arizona. This could be a good opportunity to live and work in lots of different places around the world, not just Indonesia, to really understand the challenges in science education from the point of view of someone who lives and works in those areas, and not just someone who reads about it or talks with people who live and work in that area. And so I got into my mind this idea of I would like to do this multi-year experience, starting with the Fulbright in Indonesia, and then proceeding to Ukraine, where I could work with my colleagues, and then finishing up in Brazil, where I had a colleague here who works on geoscience education. And so it was this idea of moving from let's get as far out of my comfort zone as possible, and then slowly work my way back into geoscience education, particularly digital education. So COVID cut that short. I'd been in Indonesia only about a month and a half when everything ended. I just got a rice cooker that I hadn't even taken out of the box. So it was difficult to deal with that, mostly because the Fulbright process is a multi-year process. You start maybe 2 years in advance, finding colleagues you want to work with, completing the application, then waiting for a year to hear back, and then the program can start anywhere from a few months afterwards to maybe almost a year afterwards. So it's this 2-year process to get there, and then to just have it end so abruptly was quite distressing. But I decided to kind of stay on track with what I wanted to do. So when the option came to reapply, I decided to reapply to Brazil to try for the end point of that 3-year idea.
And so I understand you chose Brazil because, as you mentioned before, you had a contact there that was already doing something in your field of work. So, when you applied for that grant, what was your initial research idea for Brazil? So, were you still interested in looking into the accessibility when it comes to the digital curriculum that you've been creating, or had you changed a little bit in terms of what you wanted to research? What did you plan on researching when you first arrived?
Yeah, so it was very similar to the idea I proposed in Indonesia, which was digital education in off-the-grid areas. But in Indonesia, what I found was that I was way out of my depth initially. I thought I'd be able to use at least some of my digital tools. But at the university where I was working, Haydn University, at that time, it was on an island in Ternate, which is in far eastern Indonesia. Um, the internet connectivity in the classrooms at that time in 2020 wasn't particularly good. So a lot of times I just didn't have Wi-Fi when I needed it. In addition, the students didn't have laptops, and a lot of the materials I've been working with for almost a decade depended on a laptop with always on internet connection. So a lot of the students were working through smartphones, and a lot of them, almost all the tools I had were not geared for smartphones. I had some tools that sort of worked, but it was a bit of a mess. And so during the pandemic, when I'd come back to the US, I started getting involved in a lot of hackathons. And with those hackathons, I met a number of people that we started developing our own applications for dealing with this kind of challenge, because none of the tools I had would work. And so when I proposed the Fulbright in Brazil, it was similar to the original idea in Indonesia, but with more knowledge now of what exactly the challenges are with digital connectivity. Because walking into Indonesia, I had no clue what the challenges would be or how I would cope with them. Whereas in Brazil, I had a better idea after my experiences in Indonesia, even though they were short.
And what were your findings from that main research in Brazil? Did you come up with a new product that was more easily adaptable to different realities? What was the scope of your experience with the research in Brazil?
So in Brazil, I got exposed to a lot more democracy-based learning. That's been one of the biggest surprises. I do a lot of work now in environmental education. And when we think of environmental education, we think of recycling, turn the lights out when you're not using them, and those kinds of activities that you could do on a day-to-day basis. But my exposure to Brazilian culture and society and learning here, especially at the University of Campinas, was that environmental education is a lot more than just the day-to-day activities you can do uh, to 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 take care of the environment. It also involves thinking about how environmental problems originate. And they often originate through marginalization of people. So if you have people that have been pushed to the outskirts of society, they're living on cliff sides or mountain sides in unregulated houses and dumping water and garbage just onto the side, you could cause a lot of environmental problems just through that, where the water that's dumped into the hillside could eventually destabilize the slopes and result in a landslide. So the exposure I had here continued to let me explore the lack of connectivity in multiple areas, such as some places where we work in the Atlantic rainforest. But it also had me thinking about more deeply about the challenges of education in general, that it's not simply about the availability of technology, the availability of connectivity, but how you involve people in that education and how you make clear to them the value of that education.
That sounds really interesting, actually, because yes, a lot of the times it's rooted in something that goes way beyond just the actual educational space, right? Um, I'm interested also because I know that you've been working now with a project, as I mentioned in the beginning, about stingless tropical bees. But I was curious about how did you come across this topic? So you were doing your research in Brazil about something different. And I'm just curious, how did the bees come into your life?
So one of the interesting things about astrobiology is you can look at animal intelligence, and it's not super well integrated into astrobiology, but there are astrobiologists who work on animal intelligence. And one of the more interesting forms of animal intelligence is hive intelligence. So bees, termites, and ants. And so I'd always wanted to have some beehives so I could just watch the bees when I lived in Arizona. But I was worried about attracting killer bees onto my property. And it also turns out that no part of my property was far enough away from the boundary where I could actually keep bees. So I never ended up keeping any beehives at my house in Arizona. When I came to Brazil, my colleague here, he has a strong interest in tropical stingless bees. And one of the first activities we did after I came to Brazil to start the Fulbright was to do a workshop on tropical stingless bees in the Guapiruvu community in the Atlantic rainforest. And so I never heard of these kinds of bees before. I didn't know they existed. I didn't even know bees came in this type of format, where they form hives and create honey, but they're completely stingless and have completely different morphologies. And so it was really neat to see that there were a species of bees that I could keep on my property without danger to myself or to anyone else. And so we continued developing projects along this avenue. So within my organization, we do a number of different projects. One is Greenworks, which helps support community projects. So helping support professors that work with communities for education and research in a type of education called extension. So we've been supporting that. But in terms of offline education, we're also working on taking the educational resources that are being developed for teaching about tropical stingless bees in these off the grid areas, in these villages that don't have a lot of internet connectivity, and start transforming some of those activities into materials we could distribute through the programs that we're developing online that can help automate some of the teaching, even though you're working in an off the grid area.
So it seems like you've kind of combined both researches into one thing, both interests. Um, I've been reading articles over the past few years claiming a few things. One is that insects in general, but particularly bees, could be on a path to mass extinction. But they play a key role in our ecosystem. So first of all, I want to ask you, is this an accurate view of the situation we're currently in?
So I can't speak much about insects because it's not my field of expertise. I consider stingless bees more of an avenue for the type of teaching and learning that I do. But in general, insects are in quite a bit of trouble because they're important pollinators of flowers and crops around the world, and our over-reliance on pesticides um, helps collapse their populations. So one of the interesting things about the stingless bees, and especially working in the Guapiruvu community, is that it's not a traditional agricultural community out in the rainforest. It does something called agroforestry, which is a type of agroecology, which my background in astrobiology was in soil sciences. So it's not a complete departure from what I'm used to studying soil sciences for my PhD and then thinking about agriculture now. But agroecology is this form of ecology that uses natural ecosystem relationships to help grow crops and protect them against diseases and pests. So in an agroforestry system, for example, you would be growing rows of mango trees and banana trees interspaced with hardwoods that you'd be growing interspaced with vegetables. And so the predators of some of the pests of one of the other plants will be living on some of the other plants. And so you have this natural ecosystem that helps keep pests down, diseases down, but it's a more complicated system to run because you need to do long-term thinking of it. Your agroforestry system will have certain vegetables and fruits that are available in the first 5 years and different ones in 10 years and even more different products in 30 years when the hardwoods can be harvested. But for the agroforestry system, native bees are particularly important because, especially in the Atlantic forest, there's a type of palm called the Jusada palm, which is similar to the acai. But the Jusada palm is in danger of extinction because it's been over-harvested. And additionally, the European and Africanized bees don't really like to pollinate that particular palm. That particular palm tends to be pollinated by more local tropical bees. And so what I heard here when I arrived was that during the pandemic, there was this increased interest um, in native tropical bees because they are local. They work better with the local ecosystem. They're depending on the species, they could be fairly easy to take care of and to multiply. And you could take honey out of them, out of the hives. And the honeys have all these different flavors and colors. And it's just a fantastic ecosystem to work in. And so even though bees are, of course, in danger from pesticides and other threats to their survival, the idea that tropical stingless bees are becoming increasingly popular to take care of and to raise is some hope to help recover their populations and their integration into the local ecosystems.
So, as you've been explaining this, very complex ecosystem and how everything works together, I was thinking, is there something that people in urban settings, right, can do on a daily basis or on, their day to day to support bees or ecosystems like this on a broader term? Let's say you're not a scientist, but you want to be mindful of this cause, right? Is there something specific that comes to mind? Would you give anybody some advice on how to uh, shop in a way that, supports agroecology or agroforests? What would you say to the average person that is looking to make a positive change on their routine, maybe?
It depends on where you're located, because here in Brazil, there are a lot of cooperatives that work with these forest communities that help distribute what they grow in the forest communities to the broader city areas like Sao Paulo and Campinas. I'm not sure if there are equivalent structures in the US, for example, or in other countries. But in terms of helping support insect populations, one of the things I think is fairly easy to do is to plant flower gardens on your property because it attracts a lot of bees. My parents do a lot of gardening, and one month when I was waiting for visa stuff to get resolved, I just spent every morning and afternoon just watching the flowers, and I counted maybe 25 different species of bees that were visiting the flowers over the course of a month. And it completely surprised me. I didn't know that there were that many species of bees. A lot of them were solitary bees. But just having a diverse set of flowers there um, attracts a lot of local pollinators. But I could also understand for a lot of people that keeping a garden and keeping flowers is a lot of work. You need to plant them, you need to water it. And at least at my former home in Arizona, I had a bit of an automated system that could keep track of the weather and give and automatically irrigate these areas when necessary. And so I would say that it would be easy to plant more flowers and more plants that can attract native pollinators. But if you're worried about taking care of them, there are a lot of low-cost technology projects you can do with your kids, with your family, with teenagers, to build systems that kind of help automate taking care of these gardens. Because I know that gardens and vegetable gardens, flower gardens can be a lot of work. But there are ways of using low-cost technology to help automate it. That's also a good learning opportunity for kids.
Actually, that's also something I was interested in asking you about because I know that you are very interested in the field of science education, as you've mentioned before. Can you tell us a little bit more about your journey in this field and how it's impacted your research? Thinking about, how to bring science to children or teenagers or, even university students. How did you start to fall onto that field of research as well?
So I always had an interest in education. When I was in college, there was an opportunity to be a teaching assistant for a course called Internet, which was on designing websites. And well, at that time, it was how to use a search engine because Google didn't exist. And so I got into teaching that way through teaching web design databases, Flash at the time, which was popular. Once I got to graduate school, I continued being a teaching assistant for various courses, and there was this one course I was teaching where we had a graduate student from the education department that came in and said, "Hey, I'm interested in doing a research project on your course and how students learn." And to me, at the time, I was doing laboratory science with chemicals and soil samples and rock samples. And the idea of you can do research on a classroom and how people learn was just mind-boggling. I didn't know that this was a type of research you could do. And so it was really fun working with her to design the experiments in the classrooms, which came to me much more naturally than laboratory experiments. We had, in this particular activity, we were looking at the habitability of Earth. And we had half the students learn about the habitability of Mars, half learn about the habitability of Venus, and then teach each other and see how they felt about it. And so ever since that experience, I started to really get into science education, not just as a calling or something that I can do because I enjoy doing it, but also as a serious field of research where you can make innovations and test out various ideas with students. And so I've just continued developing along that pathway. And it was especially impactful. I've always had, I primarily worked in the university setting and then sometimes with high school students. And occasionally I do work with informal education with like a lecture here, a public lecture here. I really got involved with the science programming at the Phoenix Comic-Con for a number of years, where I could have a lot more impact on a lot more people in a science fiction setting where people were already amenable to that type of learning. But my thinking about public education was really changed during my time in Brazil, because of something called extension. Extension originated in, I think, European and American university systems. Land grant institutions in the US had a requirement that if we're going to give you land, you have to take your education, your research out to the farmers. So Pennsylvania State University, where I did my PhD, is one such university, and they have extension activities. But here in Latin America, there's a different approach towards extension, that it's not just something you do if you feel like it. At least in the Brazilian constitution, extension is a mandated activity alongside education and research for universities throughout Brazil. And so I've been more exposed to the extension model here with the project at Guapiruvu. It's not just a one-time visit to teach them about bees. It's a long-term 5, 6, 7-year association where the community tells us what we need, what they need, and we find the experts and we find the materials and we design the programs to help them meet those needs. And it's such a powerful model that I've started through Science Voices. I've started trying to move that model into some of our other partner communities. In Indonesia, they already do something similar, but they were very interested in the approach of, wait, we can do an extension course on our campus on the weekends. And in Ukraine, especially, there was this idea of, wait, I can talk to the people of the community and ask them what they're interested in. And so my thinking on education has started to expand beyond just the classroom and thinking more about lifelong learning, especially through this extension model.
That sounds really interesting. And as you were talking, I definitely want to know more about it. But one of the things that I do want to take the opportunity to do, since we're talking to somebody who's specializing in this and has had different experiences with science teaching, is there something that families or teachers can do to kind of introduce science education to children or teenagers in a way that is engaging, that is also helpful? Do you have any tips from your classroom years or from your research about small things that people can do that can help their children or the people around them feel more interested in science and maybe not so scared or
Yeah, so this is something I've done a lot of thinking of because I wasn't very successful in my PhD defense many, many years ago because I didn't actually understand how science worked. I thought it worked like a lawyer. You have a case that you're trying to prove and you find all the evidence to support the case. And that's not how science works at all. It's the popular image of science that, ooh, I have a crazy theory and I'm going to prove it. But that's not science. Science is more about, it's an exploration to observe the universe around you and to figure out the things that are definitely not true. So science can't prove what is true. In order to figure out what is absolutely 100% true, you have to make 100% of all possible observations in the universe. And for a human mind, that simply isn't possible. But what you can do is you can identify the ideas that are definitely not true. And so one of the challenges of science education is that there are two aspects of science education. There's science, the process, and then there's science, the results. And so the process is difficult to teach, often because people don't actually understand how the process works. They think it proceeds, oh, I make a guess, it turns into a hypothesis, it turns into a theory, it turns into a fact, or something like that. And that's completely wrong. Science does not work that way. It does not progress that way. And so because most people don't understand how science as a process works, they focus on teaching science as a body of knowledge, as here are all the things that science has discovered, which is interesting. But if you're not into science, it can be boring because not only do you have to memorize a bunch of minutia about what science has discovered, if it changes, then you don't get the idea of why did this change? I learned this when I was in 5th grade, but now you're saying it's this. Do you even know what you're doing? Why should I listen to any of you? And so I think what would be important for teachers to do when they're teaching science, especially at any level, is to make sure that it is an exploratory process, that you are engaging kids' curiosity in exploring the world around them and teaching them how to record what they observe around them, whether it's through their eyes, their ears, or any other senses. And then it's important to teach the process of science. And the process of science is the way I teach my students is that we make all these observations, but the observations aren't the only component of science because you can't make every possible observation in the universe. You have to fill in the gaps with assumptions. And this is where the creativity of science comes in. I've observed this, and that, and I'm assuming that this is why this is happening. And those assumptions come from your culture, your experience, your language, your family, your religion, all the experiences that make you you. But the process of science is taking those assumptions that you use to fill in the gaps between the observations, and you test those assumptions. You test those assumptions to see if they're correct or not. And so if a teacher wants to really teach the process of science, you have to strip out all the jargon about hypothesis, theory, experiment, sigma, and things like that, and get down to what the basic thinking is. And the basic thinking of science is, how do we move from naive ideas to ideas that are not naive? We have all these observations we can make, but we have to fill in the gaps with assumptions. How do we test those assumptions to see if they're correct or not? And when you start thinking about science this way, it opens up a whole lot of possibilities for what you can do in the classroom that's different from a typical science classroom where you're learning a whole bunch of facts. If you're testing assumptions and looking at assumptions, students get to bring themselves into the science classroom. And some of the assumptions that students have about how the world works are really interesting and gives teachers a lot of room for exploration.
So I'm getting that the advice is a little bit more of an open mind as well, and a lot of creativity into that process of teaching. Um, that kind of takes me to the next topic I'd like to ask you a little bit more about, which is, you've realized that what you were researching with the stingless tropical bees in Brazil might have an impact in Indonesia, where you'd already been researching something else. So, how did you start that process of like knowledge exchange? How is that going? And when did it hit you that this was something you could actually connect to like your previous grant and the research that you were doing there?
Absolutely. So one of the experiences I had in Brazil was this idea of building South-South collaborations. There's an attitude in a lot of places that knowledge and experience should only flow north to south, like from the global north to the global south. I'm the American, I'm the expert, I know everything, I'm going to come here, give you all my experience, all my knowledge. You're welcome. But there is a lot of local knowledge that's heavily developed and exists in its own systems that are quite interesting and more effective because they either develop from local sources or they take international experience and adapt them for local realities. And so, especially as the global north has found itself racked in political problems that have led to it retreating from a lot of helpful work that helped a lot of the global south, there's this attitude now that we need to build connections here ourselves. And so that's been some of the talk of the lectures and the seminars I've been going to here in Brazil, that we need to work on South-South collaborations. But a challenge with building South-South collaborations, according to some of these articles I've been reading, is that because there's this dependency built in North-South collaborations, the North gives, the South receives, that when you build a South-South collaboration, they either try to mimic the North-South approach of I give, you receive, or you have two receivers that don't know how to exchange information. And so, given that Brazil and Indonesia are both members of the Global South, and given that I've had Fulbrights in both of those and continue to work with both groups, and they're both in similar settings, tropical. Um, one's an island, one's not, but there's coastlines in Brazil, so there's definitely ways that we can move information across. But the idea started to be that through Science Voices, we don't just bring expertise from north to the south. We start helping connect our various collaborators together so that we can build on knowledge that's actually locally relevant. So with the bees, there was this happy coincidence that at Hairun University, when I visited there again in 2023, my colleague in Brazil asked if they have any bee projects that they work on in Indonesia. And so I asked around, and there were a few people who worked on bees, and they showed me around. I took some photos and brought that information back to Brazil. And then we started seeing what can we do, what information can we develop? Because in Indonesia, I'm sure there is a lot of information on tropical stingless bees, but in Ternate, where I worked, which is more remote and a little more impoverished, there is a paucity of information. So a lot of the work that they're doing there, they're just getting started. And so they're looking for any information on tropical bees that can help them with raising them, with processing the honey, extracting the honey, replicating them, and teaching people about them. And so it's a perfect place where we can build this collaboration between Brazil and Indonesia on a topic that may seem esoteric, but is valuable to the local economies in both places.
Absolutely. And you're talking about local economies, and I've been thinking, your work is often done on a community level lately, as of lately at least. So, can you tell us a little bit about how the Fulbright experiences have also contributed, to that community level thinking. But also, how did you feel those experiences were in terms of adapting to the local cultures and local community, coming from Arizona and then going to, a remote island in Indonesia, or to, a Brazilian community that's trying to do agroforestation, or um, how was the adaptation, and what do you think are the similarities between working on a community level and the Fulbright program itself, and it being so community based as well?
So I think because the Fulbright program is a diplomatic program, the idea is to uh, in order to have diplomatic connections between places, you need to really understand them. And you can't really understand a place from just what's in the media or what's on TikTok or Instagram, and what's posted online. A lot of a lot of that culture is derived from local community culture that is not always online, and that unfolds kind of in the quiet spaces between online posts. And so, um, what Fulbright allowed me to do was to really delve into the communities where I was living, both in Indonesia and Brazil. And it provided an opportunity that would have been difficult to get any other way, mostly because a lot of the bureaucracy in local grants and local scholarships and local programs can be quite difficult to maneuver. But Fulbright kind of cuts through all that and focuses on let's get you there so you can do your work. And so I've really appreciated that about the Fulbright program. And working at the community level, I remember one time talking to one of my friends and saying, hey, there's so many problems in the world and nobody seems to be tackling them or tackling them with any urgency. Working between communities in multiple countries can also be difficult, and it often leaves me distressed that I'm only working with a few places. It can be difficult because of language barriers, time barriers. What if I just end up working at one local community and that's it? Those are all my projects. And she said, and that's enough, because if everyone did that, if everyone focused on their communities and making them just a little bit better, then we will have changed the world. You don't need to change the world at the global level. If everyone works at the community level and understands what the community needs and how to help that community, we can change the world. It's just going to be through many, many different people and not grand actors.
I love that. I think that is the perfect mindset when we're trying to, to make a difference. Sometimes we got to think local, because yeah, it's very hard to change everything all at once. Um, that being said, what would you say to somebody who's considering applying for a Fulbright Award abroad?
I would say do it. Um, I would say do it. But more than that, find a place that challenges your boundaries because for me, it would have been easy to apply for Ukraine because I speak the language, I'm familiar with the culture, and I have colleagues there. But I also thought because it's easy for me to get there that I could just do it on my own. I don't need to work through the Fulbright program. Through the Fulbright program, I should look at places where I wouldn't normally go, where I wouldn't normally have opportunities, and get there that way. And so I would say not only apply, but find something that really challenges your boundaries and gives you an opportunity to do something you wouldn't do through any other program, because it will have an impact on you. And more importantly, you'll have an impact on the people there. When I applied for Indonesia, I originally applied to work in Yogyakarta, at, I think, a very popular university. And when I got the award, the Fulbright Commission in Indonesia said, hey, everyone go set university. Could you please go somewhere else? We want to kind of spread the contributions from foreign scholars to other places. And so when they said, how about Ternate? I was like, where's that? It's like, never mind. I don't know where it is. That's probably already sufficient to say yes.
I think that's a great mindset. That's a great way to approach not only the program, but life in general. So, if somebody is interested in the B project, which just to clarify, as I understand it, so you're supporting this local community in, for instance, having these bee colonies that can, the ultimate end is to support the agroforestation, or is it to also produce, local honey that can then be sold on the surrounding region? So, what's the end goal? Of that project specific to that community needs that you said they expressed, what was their need, and what are you working towards achieving with them?
So with this particular community, it's, as you mentioned, it's to improve local pollination of local plants, as well as to improve the economic outlook because these honeys are quite expensive because the bees that produce them, they could be anywhere from honeybee size to smaller, and they don't produce a whole lot of honey. And so there are different extraction methods for those honeys. And because the honeys have a lot more water than honeybee honey, they spoil a lot more quickly. So they need to be processed, either through removal of some of the water, refrigeration. And so it makes the honeys expensive. But because they have so many different flavor profiles and health benefits, it's a lot of income for the people in that community. But more broadly, with the connections with Indonesia, is to kind of spread that knowledge between places and to think more broadly, not just beyond the bee, not just about bees, but other environmental challenges we deal with. So in Indonesia, one of the big challenges is plastic pollution, and they're looking for solutions on that. And we're looking at connecting them with Ukrainians who have a great expertise now in drone technologies and using some of those drone technologies to monitor coastal environments to understand the patterns of plastic pollution. So specifically with the bee projects, we're continuing to build out the networks um, to help improve the level of knowledge of native bees and how to take care of them and how to deal with the honey, working with local experts and local networks and just helping network them together. But thinking more broadly on this network, how can we expand into agroforestry, transmitting knowledge across that, plastic pollution, energy security, and lots of different projects. And so not only do we work on enhancing these connections across the world, when we have the funding, we also help support basically startup projects for these communities. So the idea is we have some funds in the organization that we then use to help professors start up projects with these communities so they can kind of develop their own income. And then we use more funds that we raise to put together more startup packages for new members who want to join the network, so that not only are we helping start the network and develop the skills, we also help these communities become self-sufficient so we can use the funds that we have to onboard new communities into the network.
So I assume you're talking now about your project, Science Voices. So if somebody would like to support your project as a whole, or just are interested in bees or any of the other many topics that you're working on, how do they get in touch with you? What's the best way? Do they reach you on Fulbrighter? Do they email you? Is there a website for them to go? What's the best way to reach out to you to collaborate?
Absolutely. We have a website, www.sciencevoices.org. It has information about all our programs and how to donate. Donations for the specific bee projects go through Global Giving. And we're also on Facebook and Instagram, where we do lots of updates. So sometimes the website is slow to update because it's a small team. So we have a lot of work to do in working with all these various communities as well as managing. So sometimes the updates come faster on Facebook and Instagram. But basically the website, Facebook, and Instagram are the best ways to get in contact and learn more about the programs that we work on at Science Voices.
That sounds great. And we are coming to the end of our interview. So, first of all, thank you very much for all the knowledge you shared. I think it was possible to see that you have many different interests, but I find it really interesting as well how you've been able to align them and to kind of knit them together to bring even more interesting things out of them. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners before we go?
Um, I'd like to share that the Fulbright experience was amazing, and I'm happy that even after the pandemic, there was the opportunity to try again immediately, because there's usually a bit of a waiting period for it. And it's a program that I think brings a lot of benefits. I know I've helped a few people with their Fulbright applications. They were asking me for advice on how to go about applying for the program, and I think it's a wonderful program to do. I think it's beneficial professionally, and also it brings so much benefit to the people you work with that even now, five years later, I'm still working with a lot of the people that I met on the Fulbright program, and I've even grown those networks, especially in places like Indonesia, where I've met even more people that, had I been able to stay there, I probably would have eventually met, but I'm getting to meet them now. And it was that initial contact that helped.
That's amazing. So thank you so much for sharing that as well. So that's the end of our podcast. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us, Lev. And I want to wish you the very best with your research everywhere that you decide to take it. And also a big thank you to all of our listeners and all of the Fulbright community. We'll see you next time.